It was the wedding dinner when the fiancée suddenly threw a drink straight into the maid's face. In the seconds that followed, the entire ballroom froze. I still cannot believe this actually happened. More than 300 guests filled that magnificent space. Crystal chandeliers sparkling overhead, white roses blooming on every table, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. This was supposed to be the most elegant PI wedding celebration of the year, the kind of evening people would speak about for decades. Then a woman in a designer gown rose to her feet, looked directly at the young maid quietly clearing the table beside her, and hurled a full glass of deep red wine straight into her face. The music stopped. The room fell into absolute silence. Every single person stood motionless. Yet what happened in the next 60 seconds was something no one in that room was prepared for. Not the billionaire groom, not the high-priced wedding planner, and not even the woman who had thrown the drink. Because the maid did not cry. She did not run. She simply stood there, dripping, and spoke 3 quiet words that changed everything. If this is your first time here, we are so glad you found us. This channel is your home for real, emotional human stories, the kind that remind us why kindness, truth, and love will always matter more than money or status. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. We love seeing our community light up from every corner of the world. What you are about to hear is one of the most deeply emotional and twist-filled stories we have ever shared. It begins at a luxury PI wedding dinner in Manhattan. It involves a billionaire, his beautiful fiancée, and a quiet young maid whom everyone had overlooked. But trust me, by the time this story ends, you will be looking at the people around you very differently. Stay with us. Every single moment is worth it. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one holding the most important truth in the room. Her name was Lila, a young woman of 28 with soft brown eyes and dark hair always pulled back into a neat bun. Her hands were never quite free of work. She had been employed at the Grand Sterling Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for several years. She began as a housekeeping assistant and was gradually promoted to event staff on the premium banquet floor. It was not a glamorous job, but Lila carried it out with a quiet dignity that her supervisors noticed. Even if the guests rarely did, the Sterling was the kind of hotel that charged $1,500 a night for a standard room, the kind where guests arrived in black SUVs, wore watches worth more than most people's cars, and rarely made eye contact with the staff who kept their world running smoothly. Lila had learned early on not to take it personally. She kept her head down, her movements invisible, and her work impeccable. She had grown up in a small town in rural Ohio, the daughter of a school bus driver and a woman who cleaned houses to pay the bills. Lila had watched her mother work herself to exhaustion every single day, never once complaining, never once asking for recognition. That was the example she had been raised with. Work hard, stay humble, keep going. She had come to New York with little more than a second-hand suitcase, $200 in her pocket, and a fierce, quiet determination to build something real. She shared a tiny apartment in the Bronx with 2 other women, sent money home to her parents every month, and took night classes in hospitality management at a community college several evenings a week. No one at the hotel knew the full story of Lila's life. That was the thing about people like her. They became almost invisible, not because they were unimportant, but because the world had trained itself not to truly see them. The evening of the KPI wedding dinner was the biggest event the hotel's banquet floor had hosted all year. 38 tables, more than 300 guests, a custom floral installation that had taken days to assemble. The hotel's event director, a sharp woman named Miss Langford, had briefed every staff member thoroughly. Everything had to be perfect because the groom was Alexander Kane, a young man who had built a tech company from his dorm room at MIT and sold it years later for a fortune. Since then, he had invested in several more companies, some of which had gone public. To many observers, he was a phenomenon, but those who truly knew Alexander described him differently. They said he was decent genuinely, unusually decent for someone with that level of wealth. He had a habit of learning the names of everyone who worked around him. He tipped generously and without performance. He had quietly funded a scholarship program for first-generation college students, never once mentioning it publicly. He was not perfect, but he was real in a way that very few people with his wealth ever managed to stay. His fiancée was Victoria Hale, also in her late 20s. She was stunning in a way that made rooms shift slightly when she entered. She had grown up in wealth herself. Her father ran a private equity firm, and she carried that background with an ease that could read as elegance or cool detachment, depending on your perspective. Alexander and Victoria had been together for some time. Their engagement had been announced in the New York Times. Their wedding was just days away. Lila had been assigned to Victoria's side of the room that evening. She refilled water glasses. She cleared appetizer plates. She moved quietly and efficiently through the table arrangements, head down, steps light. She had noticed Victoria watching her a couple of times during the first hour, not the distracted glance of someone checking whether a glass was full, but something more deliberate, more measuring. Lila told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. What would you do if you felt someone watching you but could not figure out why? Would you speak up, or would you keep your head down and keep moving? The most dangerous secrets are not the ones people hide in the dark. They are the ones hiding in plain sight at a table covered in white roses. The dinner progressed beautifully on the surface. The speeches were warm. The food was extraordinary. Laughter moved around the room in comfortable waves. Alexander sat at the center of the head table, easy and relaxed, shaking hands and leaning into conversations with a natural warmth that made people love him. Victoria sat beside him, radiant and composed. She laughed at the right moments. She touched his arm at the right moments. She was performing the role of adoring fiancée with a polish that came from a lifetime of knowing how rooms worked and how to own them. But underneath that polish, something was moving. Lila noticed it in small ways, the way Victoria's eyes tracked her whenever she approached the table. The way Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Alexander turned to thank Lila for refilling his water with a genuine smile and a quiet, "Thank you, Lila." Lila had nodded. Alexander had noticed her name tag and remembered it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing decent people did automatically. Victoria had noticed him noticing during the third course. An older woman seated near Victoria, a family friend named Margaret, leaned toward her and said something quietly. Lila was not close enough to hear the words, but she saw Victoria's expression shift. Just for a second, something flickered behind those polished eyes, not hurt, not sadness, but calculation. Lila cleared the salad plates from the far end of the table and moved back toward the service corridor, pushing the cart quietly. She had learned to read the emotional weather of a room the way some people read financial reports quickly, accurately, and with an understanding that the undercurrents mattered, even when nobody wanted to admit it. Something was wrong that night. She could feel it in the air, the way you can feel a storm coming before the clouds arrive. She was refilling the breadbasket at a corner table when she overheard two of Victoria's friends, both seated close enough to the service area that they did not think to lower their voices. "She found out last week," one of them said, "about the trust, the full amount. The clause was the key." The other replied, "Then does Alexander know she knows?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Lila kept her face completely neutral. She moved away from the table. She breathed slowly. She was a professional. Whatever she had just heard was none of her business. But something in her chest had gone very still and very alert. Some time later, she was clearing a dessert plate from Victoria's direct left when it happened. She was not sure what set it off, whether it was something Margaret whispered, or whether Victoria had simply been holding the pressure inside for so long that it finally found a release. Victoria turned. She looked at Lila with an expression that was almost frighteningly calm. Then she picked up her wineglass, a full pour of deep red, and threw it directly into Lila's face. The liquid hit Lila like a cold slap. Red wine soaked her white uniform and ran down her cheeks and hair. The plate she had been holding clattered to the floor. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The music stopped. 300 people froze. Alexander's face went white. He was on his feet before anyone else moved. Victoria, what? But Lila stood there, dripping, completely still. In a voice that was quiet, clear, and absolutely steady, she said 3 words. I know everything. Have you ever been publicly humiliated for something that was not your fault? How did you find the strength to stay standing? Those 3 words were all it took to make a billionaire's perfect evening shatter like glass on a marble floor. The silence that followed was the loudest thing most people in that room had ever heard. Victoria's expression did not crack immediately. She was too practiced for that. But something behind her eyes shifted, a sudden recalculation, rapid and cold, like a chess player realizing too late that the game had already slipped away. Alexander stared at Lila. What did you just say? Lila reached up and slowly pulled a wine-soaked cloth napkin from the edge of the table. She pressed it gently to her face. She was not shaking. Later, people who were there that night would say that was the thing they remembered most, how still she was. How completely and impossibly composed. Mr. Kane, Lila said in that same quiet, steady voice. I need to show you something. I'm sorry, I know this isn't the place, but I don't think there's going to be a better one. Miss Langford, the event director, had materialized at Lila's elbow from somewhere, her face tight with professional horror. Lila, this is not, please, Lila said softly. She was not speaking to Miss Langford. She was speaking to Alexander. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was raw and unreadable. Then he said, okay. Victoria stood up so fast her chair scraped back. Alexander, she is the help. She is trying to sit down, Victoria. His voice was quiet, but it landed in the room with undeniable weight. Victoria sat. Lila reached into the small pocket of her service apron, the one staff used for order pads and pens, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded many times. She held it out to Alexander. He took it and opened it. The room held its breath. What it contained was a photocopy, a screenshot printed on hotel paper and transferred to this folded page. It showed a text message exchange from a short time earlier between a number saved as V and a number saved as Attorney Oek. The messages concerned the King family trust. Specifically, they discussed a clause Alexander's grandfather had written years earlier. The clause stated that in the event of Alexander's marriage, if that marriage ended in divorce within the first 5 years, the majority share of his inherited trust allocation would transfer not to him, but back into a protected family fund, inaccessible to any former spouse. The messages showed Victoria asking the attorney how to structure a post-nuptial agreement in a way that would quietly redirect a separate portion of Alexander's liquid assets, the money not covered by the trust clause, before any potential separation. She had been preparing for a divorce even before the wedding had taken place. The attorney's final message recommended moving forward no later than 30 days after the ceremony. Alexander read it once, then again. The color had completely drained from his face. Someone at a nearby table made a soft, involuntary sound, the kind of sound you make when something hurts on behalf of another person. Victoria broke first. That is private correspondence. That is illegal. She stole that. She had no right. Where did you get this? Alexander asked Lila, his voice controlled, but only barely. Where did you get this? Lila took a breath. Your attorney's office, the one mentioned in the document. His paralegal is my neighbor, Mr. Kane. She didn't show it to me on purpose. I saw the messages on her screen when I was helping her carry groceries into her apartment a couple of evenings ago. I wasn't trying to see it, but I recognized your name and hers. I didn't know what to do. I almost didn't say anything, but I kept thinking if it were me, I would want to know. The room remained completely silent. Alexander looked at Lila for a long moment, his eyes bright. He was not a man who cried easily. Everyone who knew him knew that, but he was very close to it right then. Then he turned to Victoria. What would you have done in Alexander's place in that moment? Would you have believed Lila? Or would you have stood by the person you loved? Sometimes the truth does not arrive the way you expected. Sometimes it arrives soaked in red wine. Standing quietly in a white uniform, what followed in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic in the way movies make scenes dramatic. There were no screams. No one threw anything else. The 300 guests did not erupt into chaos. Instead, what happened was quieter and, in many ways, more devastating than any explosion could have been. Alexander excused himself and Victoria from the room. Two of his closest friends, men he had known since college, followed. The event continued in a stunned and surreal half-silence. Guests spoke to one another in low voices. The string quartet resumed softly at Miss Langford's tense instruction. Everyone pretended, with varying degrees of success, that nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Lila was taken to the staff break room by Miss Langford, who handed her a clean uniform with the expression of a woman trying very hard to process several things at once. "Are you all right?" Miss Langford asked. "Yes, ma'am, you understand that there will be a review of this." "I understand, miss." Langford looked at her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she placed her hand briefly on Lila's shoulder. "You did something very brave tonight," she said quietly. Lila nodded. She sat down in a plastic chair in the break room and let herself finally exhale. In the private suite on the hotel's 14th floor. Alexander Kane sat across from Victoria and asked her directly whether what was in that document was real. She tried several approaches in sequence: denial, reframing, partial admission wrapped in justification. She said the trust clause had made her afraid. She said she had only been protecting herself. She said that wealthy marriages were complicated, and that everyone had attorneys who planned for contingencies, and that Lila had no idea what she had actually seen. Alexander listened to all of it. Then he asked her one question. "Did you love me at any point in our time together? Was any of it real?" In the pause that followed, a pause that stretched on just long enough to become its own answer, Victoria's composure finally broke. Not into tears, but into something harder and more honest. "I don't know," she said. "I thought I did. I think I convinced myself I did. But I was also scared of ending up with nothing. And you had so much." She stopped. Alexander nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think you should go." The engagement ended that night. Quietly, privately, without any public announcement. The wedding that had been just days away was called off the following morning. The vendors were notified. The guests received a brief and dignified message from Alexander's family office saying the event had been postponed indefinitely. There was no public drama, no social media war. Alexander Kane, true to everything people said about his character, refused to humiliate Victoria publicly. He simply let it end, and he allowed himself to sit with the particular grief of realizing that a relationship he had believed in had been built on something fractured from the very beginning. But before any of that, before he went upstairs to face the conversation that would end his engagement, Alexander returned to the banquet floor. He walked through the still murmuring crowd, past the white roses and the half-eaten desserts and the guests who watched him with wide eyes, and he went to the staff break room door. He knocked. Lila opened it. He looked at her still in the clean uniform, her hair still slightly damp, and said, "Thank you. I know that took courage. I know you risked your job to tell me the truth when you had absolutely nothing to gain from it." "I'm not going to forget that." Lila looked at him. "I just thought about what was right," she said simply. He nodded. And then Alexander Kane, the young billionaire, quietly shook the hand of the hotel maid who had changed the entire direction of his life. "Do you think Lila made the right choice? Would you have had the courage to speak up, knowing everything you risked?" The world does not always reward the right thing immediately, but it has a way of finding the people who do it anyway. The weeks after that night were not easy for Lila. There was an internal review at the hotel, as promised. There were questions about the document, about the paralegal neighbor, about what Lila had seen and how. The legal team representing Alexander's family office became involved, and for a period of several weeks, Lila's employment status remained uncertain in a way that kept her lying awake at night, running the numbers in her head: rent, food, her parents' bills, the community college tuition she was close to completing, She did not regret what she had done. But she also understood very clearly that doing the right thing did not come with a guarantee of safety. Her neighbor, the paralegal, was quietly let go from the attorney's office for the privacy breach, though the circumstances were ultimately ruled accidental, and no legal charges were pursued against Lila or her neighbor. Lila felt the weight of that. She brought her neighbor dinner several evenings in a row and helped her update her resume. That was Lila, even in the middle of her own uncertainty. She thought about the person next to her. The review at the hotel concluded with a formal letter from management. Lila sat in Miss Langford's office and read it carefully. It confirmed that no disciplinary action would be taken. It also noted that her conduct throughout the incident had been described by senior management as demonstrating exceptional character and professionalism under extraordinary circumstances. Ms. Langford slid a second envelope across the desk. It was from Alexander Kane's family office. Inside was a letter, brief and personal, signed by Alexander himself. Attached to it was a certified check, a significant one, with a note that read, "For your education, for your future, for being the kind of person the world needs more of. Please finish your degree, then build something great." Lila stared at that check for a long time. It was enough to cover the rest of her degree. Enough to clear her parents' remaining mortgage in Ohio. Enough to give her, for the first time in her adult life, a few months of breathing room. She cried in Miss Langford's office, not pretty, composed tears, but real ones. She called her mother that evening from the bench outside the hotel's employee entrance, sitting in the cool night air with her coat pulled tight. She told her everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she always had. And when Lila finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, I raised you to be exactly who you were in that room. I am so proud of you." Lila pressed the phone against her and let herself be held by those words across the miles. In the months that followed, Lila finished her hospitality management degree. She was promoted at the hotel to junior event coordinator, a role with a desk, a salary increase, and responsibilities she tackled with the same quiet intensity she had always brought to every task. She and Alexander Kane never became close friends. That was not the story. But once, some months later, he returned to the hotel for a corporate event. He saw her in the corridor near the banquet floor. He stopped. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "How are you?" he asked. "Really good," she said, and she meant it. He nodded. "I can tell." As for Alexander himself, he took some time away from the social circuit. He traveled. He worked. He came back quieter and, by most accounts, even more himself. He started dating again, slowly, carefully. He did not rush. He had learned, at a table full of white roses, that the most important thing you could do before trusting someone was to actually pay attention. And Lila kept going the way she always had, head up now, instead of down. Not because the world had suddenly become kinder, but because she had learned something that night, standing soaked in red wine in a room full of frozen strangers, that doing the right thing, the hard, costly, uncertain right thing, does not make you weak. It makes you the most powerful person in the room. This story is about more than a wedding that did not happen. It is about what we choose to do when we see something wrong, when speaking up costs or something real, when staying quiet would have been so much easier. Lila was invisible to most people in that room, but she saw clearly, and she spoke anyway. There are Lilas everywhere, in hotel hallways, in office break rooms, in small apartments sending money home. People who move quietly through a world that barely acknowledges them, carrying a dignity and decency that puts the so-called powerful to shame. See those people. Be that person. The moral of this story is simple, and it is everything. Your character is not defined by what you do when the world is watching. It is defined by what you do when you think no one would ever know. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you think about your own courage, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to us. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that remind us of our best selves. We share them every single week, and in the comments, I want to hear from you. Would you have spoken up like Lila did? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your place? There are no wrong answers, just honest ones. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded today that quiet people carry the loudest kind of courage. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. We'll see you in the next one.